Ashot, thank you for joining Opus 93.
Thank you for having me, Tika.
Let's tell us a little bit about your start in music, where you graduated.
Well, start in music, I pretty much started music at Lark. My parents put me in music school right when I was 7, 8 years old, so I've been playing piano ever since then. I graduated the Lark program in piano and composition, and then went to Cal State Northridge for my degree in composition, which I got a bachelor's in music.
I hear there's a concert coming up. Tell us a little bit about the concert.
Yes, on April 15th, the Didi John Chamber Concert Series is going to premiere one of my trios, which they've actually commissioned. So it's a piano trio, piano, violin, cello, and it'll be in 3 movements. And they're fantastic musicians, world famous musicians, and it really is an honor for me to have this kind of performance. But April 15th, it's basically the day that the trio is.
So tell us a little bit about the compositional style of the trio specifically. I mean, what would you compare it to, as far as if you were to compare it to a certain composer or a piece, if you could do that?
I would say well, the trio itself is in 3 movements, and I would say all 3 movements have their own kind of distinction. I pretty much treated the piece itself sort of as each instrument is an individual, and the trio itself is kind of a game between all of these. For example, if I were to break it down into movements, the first movement I would say is kind of a chase between. It's a lot of constant running happening, a constant when you hear it, you'll understand what I mean by chase. But basically, they're kind of just passing the ball to each other, constantly chasing each other, playing themes back and forth. Very active. It's probably the most serious out of the 3 movements as in a form, and in a 20th century thing has harmonic senses, but not necessarily such a tonal center. The second movement is more of a slow melodramatic. Imagine if in the chase they all caught each other, how would they kind of deal? It's more of a dialogue between the instruments. I do bring back themes from my first movement, but it's more of kind of more in that eerie kind of sense. And the third movement which is probably my favorite movement, is more of a game. It's kind of a play on rhythms, I'll have specific thematic material that's constantly coming back in, whether a different time, a different tempo, a different feel. And again, it has glimpses of the other movements in there to somewhat connect the movements together. So that's how I would describe the trio itself. I can't necessarily think of a piece that it's similar to, primarily because the movements are so different. Usually pieces will have more of the similar type of idea. I can see these movements being seen as 3 separate pieces of their own if you didn't realize that the thematic material is similar, that I'm bringing back. But that's how I would describe it as far as the trio itself.
Have you written for a trio before of similar makeup?
I have not exactly a piano trio, but I've used all of these instruments before in other things. I have written trios in general before, with, let's say, a trio with a piano, cello, flute, for example, or other types of ensembles. So a trio isn't necessarily something new to me, and neither are the instruments. They're 3 of the most used instruments: piano, cello, and violin. I didn't necessarily concentrate too much on all the possible things I can do with the instruments. I was more interested in the thematic and melodic and actual musical aspect of it, as opposed to, let's say, extended techniques or things like that. But yeah.
So as a pianist, you don't want to participate in the performance?
Well, they have a fantastic and amazing pianist that's going to play it, and I'm completely honored that she would actually accept to play the trio. So she'll definitely even though I play piano, I'm sure she's going to do a fantastic job, and I just can't wait to see how she does it.
Ashot, tell us about your current, if you have any mentors now, and past teachers or mentors that you work with.
Well, you know, I would say my biggest mentor is my father. You know, he was my first composition instructor, and even till now, you know, years later, I'll always want his opinion. You know, his second opinion is always my primary choice. I put a lot of you know, importance to what he says. You know, even though a lot, you know, I may not agree with all the, you know, things that I get, but he's definitely, you know, helped me guide my musicality, guide just the way I think and approach just composing in general. Of course, Vacher Barsumyan, you know, the director of l'Art Conservatory, he's always been the pusher of me. You know, he's always commissioning pieces. He's always trying to expand my compositional technique by, you know, telling me to write for different instruments, telling me these, and of course very helpful in getting a lot of my pieces performed. Yeah. You know, I have, you know, endless gratitude towards him for just constantly, you know, pushing me in that direction. And, you know, Liviu Marinescu, my composition professor at CSUN, he, you know, I really have to credit him for just actually opening my ears to a lot of new music. You know, before going to him, I really hadn't listened to a lot of composers. He really opened me up to the 20th century. He really, you know, showed me certain types of techniques that, you know, I hadn't gotten anywhere else in all sorts of, in all ways in composing. And he definitely has also his own view of looking at pieces, and I always take that into consideration too. So he's definitely been a help to me too. You know, and of course, you know, I've always had a lot of supporting people around me, as far as family, friends, you know, my faculty members. So it's always been in a positive light, you know, knock on wood.
So is this trio a dedication, or do you usually have dedications to
be honest, I usually haven't. I haven't necessarily dedicated the trio anywhere. It was a specific commission from the Dirijan, you know, chamber series, as I said. But I haven't specifically dedicated it to anyone or anything else other than the Dirijan. You know, usually I feel like I would commission my own work if I were to dedicate it somewhere. So yeah, and as far as motivational things, you know, I wasn't necessarily thinking of something specific, you know, when I was doing the trio. You know, kind of I took it movement at a time. To be honest, I kind of always imagined a Tom and Jerry situation. Tom and Jerry, you know, and the dog, and these were kind of the representatives of my instruments, you know, like the piano, the cello, and the violin. So this was always what would come in mind, and kind of how I would imagine them to act together is kind of the way I approached to writing the trio itself. Yeah. So
you mentioned you wrote a lot of other chamber music. Tell us a little bit about other pieces that you've composed.
Mostly, I would say I've written for string instruments. I've written several string quintets, you know, one of which it was only 5 violins. More during my school days, I wrote a lot more trio type ensembles. You know, I had another trio, you know, for an odd ensemble, which was piano, baritone, saxophone, and clarinet. You know, some recommendations, you know, to use instruments that you don't hear often. You know, I've written for all sorts. You know, I have a woodwind octet I've written, you know, strictly for woodwind instruments, and also smaller, you know, 2-people chamber pieces as well, just like piano flute, piano violin, you know, just things. So I would definitely say I've concentrated much more on the chamber aspect as opposed to, let's say, orchestral. Whether it's chamber orchestra or symphonic orchestra, my experience in those is definitely much more minimal than in a chamber series. But you know, I plan on expanding in all ways.
So this next question is something I ask of all our composer guests.
Yes.
What's your compositional method? Do you compose at nights, mornings, or do you have a method to this?
To be honest, most of the time I compose happens to me in a non-compositional environment. most of the things I think about are happening when I'm not concentrating, trying to think. I'll usually have just music constantly flowing in my mind, but I won't necessarily attribute it to only in the daytime or only at nighttime. You know, my ideas will just come to me anytime throughout the day, while I'm driving, while I'm sleeping, I'm in the shower, you know, just constantly. So it's these ideas that I'll just keep in mind, and then I'll just go put it down on paper and write it. So time-wise, it doesn't, you know, do anything. And yeah, there are certain things that, let's say, would motivate me. But I'm not necessarily such a motivational type composer either. I don't need to be in a specific surrounding to be able to concentrate or anything. I think music just comes to me, and then I just write it down whenever I have the time to do it. And
lastly, what's Ashot's favorite composer? I mean, that's a kind of a very strict question. Is there composers specifically in the 20th century that you? Well,
speaking 20th century, I guess it all depends on how forward you count it. You know, like if you're thinking early 20th century, you know, like Ravel is one of my most favorite composers, just because I love a lot of his chamber, all of his music, you know, and anything pre him, I can name you tons. After him, you know, it's all like Bartók, for example, has amazing things coming more forward. You know, I love the colors of Messiaen. You know, Ligeti, you know, has fantastic. Like, you know, I could just name one after another just of composers that have just, you know, just rocked my world. Just only because they've brought so many new things to me that I would imagine myself, wow, I would love to write something in this sense, you know, with these composers. Not all of them, of course, you know, 20th century is full of, you know, a vast majority variety of all sorts of things. But definitely, you know, from those guys, I've definitely taken something and tried to incorporate their ideas and things like that into my music as well.
Thank you, Ashot, for joining Opus 93. We'll be at your concert, and hope to see you again at this program.
Thanks again. Thank you.